Is there such a thing as a picture-perfect home? We'd like to think so.
Reality shows us that there's nothing like a picture-perfect home. In our homes, there are closets we don't let anyone near, because we know what skeletons are in those closets.
We hope the ideal home exists, but we struggle to find it.
We look for young families,
Older families,
multi-generational families.
Christian families who can present themselves as picture-perfect.
We look for famous authors who write about those picture-perfect homes. But spend some time in their homes, and you will see that no family is perfect.
There are moments of rebellion,
Frustration, anger, and so on.
Each one results in some chinks in the armor of those supposed picture-perfect homes. We all need to learn how to navigate life, even when it's not picture-perfect.
So this morning we start this series that we're going to do over the next 5 weeks or so called Picture Perfect Homes. I think that's on the screen there, and that represents a lot of what our homes look like. We want them to be picture perfect, but they don't always turn out that way, but they're still good homes. And if there's one thing I want to get out in front of anything that I talk about today or the next 5 weeks is that if you have flaws and if things aren't exactly right in your home all the time and it's not always smooth, sometimes it's a little bumpy or whatever, you still can have a good home, okay? And as a matter of fact, we're going to find out this morning that there are no such things as a picture-perfect home, right? Now, one of the things that I kind of like to do, and I have done this in the past, and I did it again this week, is I like to look at old picture directories of church members. Yeah. So I asked Noni about this week, and she handed me this 30th anniversary edition of Cherokee Hills Christian Church. Some of you haven't changed a lick in 28 years. I mean, this is 1993. The ministers are different, but not really a lot. Well, there's a lot of difference, but it's just fun to look at these pictures, all these still pictures, which I didn't want to put on the screen because I didn't want to embarrass anybody. But, you know, what I like about them is that every Sunday school class has people sitting either at the table or in a chair with a Bible in their lap, and it's wide open. And it looks to me like they're all open to the same thing. And so that was entertaining. And so I started looking through, and man, the hair in 1993 was something else. And Steve doesn't have any hair. He would never pass. Lenny had hair in 93. I don't know if you know that. But here's something I really noticed that was interesting about this one directory, I hope. But if you notice, if I can hold it right, there is I'm not going to be able to show this, but somebody has gone and cut out their picture. There is sin in the camp. Tell you what. I mean, if you want to hide that, that's a bad thing. But there's all kinds of things here. And the thing that I noticed in this directory, which would be by the way, you're wondering where that is, I will just say this. It's in the G's. Okay, I don't know any more than that. But what I noticed about this is what I noticed about every picture directory, that they're full of all kinds of people who are good people, who love God in many ways. But their families all look different. Some of them have just one parent or one person, adult, with some kids. Some of them have multiple adults, 2 with kids. Some of them have grandmas and grandpas in the pictures with them and all kinds of stuff. And so you've got all of this stuff going on. We've got single people in here that haven't had any children. We've got divorced people in here. We've got people that are widowed and have lost their spouse. And we have people that were young, like in their 20s and 30s. And then we have some people in here that were in their 50s and 60s that are still alive, you know, and still going strong. One of my favorites is Russ and Margie Frisbee in here. Went and saw Russ this week at the hospital. He's got a foot infection. And, you know, for 93 and 92 or 94 and 93 or whatever it is, they're amazing. And they've been a part of this church for such a long, long time. So these picture directories tell stories, don't they? And I always want to know what the story is, and I always kind of imagine it. I wasn't around back then, so I don't know, but pictures in a church directory, you might assume that those pictures would represent the perfect family. But look around. Matter of fact, if I could hold a mirror up to you, I would say, just look at yourself. You don't have a perfect family, okay? There are no such things as perfect families, picture perfect families. I was thinking about media and how they portray families in this day and age, and TV Guide just put out not long ago a top 60 TV families. And so I picked out 10 of them, and I thought I'd just throw these out here. There are the Cleavers. Remember that? And they made the list. Yay, way to go. There's the Waltons. Okay, and they made, good night, John Boy. There's the Cunninghams. Anybody know who the Cunninghams are with? Yeah, Happy Days. The Bradys made the list. And so there's a blended family, which is, back in that day was not as common as it is now. Then there is the Huxtables, okay? And they may have been portrayed as a family, but there was a lot going on in that family that never really got out. The Bradfords. Anybody know who the Bradfords are? Who? Ada. Oh, is it up there? Oh. Man, I thought I had you. No, 8 is enough. Anybody remember watching that show all the time? I mean, that was a good show. Of course, that shows my age for sure. And there was the Keatons. Remember the Keatons, Family Ties. How about the Hecks? Anybody know who the Hecks are? Yeah, the middle, okay, which is up there. And here's the thing I love about the Hecks is you've got Dad and Mom, and they are constantly at it with everybody, And they're not an ideal family situation, but they're probably pretty real. And they've got a teenage boy, and they got a middle daughter, and then they got a little boy. And the little boy now has grown up. He's practically an adult on this show, but his name was Brick. Brick. Who names their kid Brick? I mean, I just don't even know what to think about that exactly. But that's a show that I've kind of liked watching just because of its reality more than anything else. And then there's the Barones. You know the Barones. Everybody loves Raymond. And if that is not a dysfunctional family, they're never had, and Mom and Dad live right next door, and the jealous son and all that stuff. And then the last one I picked with, which I totally disagree with almost everything. I've never even watched a whole show of it, but it's the Simpsons, not the symptoms. They're the symptom of bad things, okay? But the Simpsons, made that list, top 60 families, and I'm like, ugh, I don't like that. So I'm thinking, nobody's picture perfect, so let's go to the Bible. The Bible surely has picture perfect families, right? So we start with Adam and Eve. Was that a picture perfect family? Not so much. I mean, they got in trouble with God, and then there was this murder thing that happened in their family, so you probably wouldn't put them up there as picture perfect. And then we might think about Noah and think, well, Noah was picture perfect because when God couldn't find anybody righteous, he picked Noah and his family, and they got in the boat, and they saved humankind, right? And so we think Noah's really great. But if you read Genesis 9, you see there's some stuff that goes on in Noah's family that is not very good and creates issues for generations. And so they weren't picture perfect. Then you think about Abraham. Well, Abraham must have been picture perfect. Well, not so much. I mean, when you think about it, God had told him he's going to have, children that were going to number the numbers of sand on the sea and all this kind of stuff. And Sarah didn't really believe it because it wasn't happening. So what did Sarah offer to Abraham? Hey, I've got this handmaiden, and why don't you take her and produce a child? And oh my goodness, Abraham. Yeah, what we would have wished that Abraham had not taken her up on the offer. But he did, and it created terrible times even today that result all the way back to that. When you think about David and Bathsheba, and that wasn't perfect at all, and we'll talk a little bit more about that down the road. And so I'm getting desperate here in the Bible trying to find a perfect family, and I'm thinking, well, Jesus has got a perfect family, and but if you just use words to describe his family, the mother was really super young, and Mary was an unwed mother, and then parents lost him when he was 12 for 3 days. which all of us have wanted to lose our kids when they were 12, but Jesus' family got to do it. And then probably the thing that told a lot about their family dynamic was the brothers didn't like Jesus that much, and they tried to take hold of Jesus and scatter his ministry because they thought he was crazy. So we're 0 for 2 starting out. I mean, TV, no, and Bible picture perfect family, not really at all. So then we got to go to experts, right? Like Dr. Phil. I mean, Dr. Phil is always showing picture perfect families, right? That is a disaster waiting to happen. It's a train wreck all the time. And so you think, well, that isn't going to work. And that's one thing that we learn in life is that people who say they're experts really aren't that much at all. Some of you will remember this name, some of you won't. Charlie Shedd, who was a man that taught family dynamics all over the country and parenting and all that stuff. Charlie Shedd once wrote, "Before we had kids, I used to travel across the country teaching a lecture that I called the 10 Commandments for Raising Perfect Children. And after my wife had our first child, I changed it to 10 Hints for Parents. Then after the second child, I renamed the lecture A Few Tentative Suggestions for Fellow Strugglers. And then after the arrival of our fourth child, I gave up speaking on the subject altogether." And isn't that true? I mean, I would love to be able to say to you, I could put out a perfect family, I've got a perfect family, but I can't at all. Our family's not been perfect, it still isn't, probably won't ever be until eternity. That's how it's going to happen. So we're striking out in our search for a perfect home. And that's kind of tough. It doesn't matter whether you're young or old, married or widowed, rich or poor, married or divorced. It doesn't matter whether you're a Christian or not. Your home is not going to be perfect, okay, at all. But what I want to say to you today is that what we're going to learn over the next 5 weeks can make your home better. It can make your home better. It won't be perfect. And if I could be a fly on the wall in every one of your houses, I could point out ways that it isn't perfect. But some of the principles that we're going to talk about in this series, they're going to make your homes better. And it doesn't matter whether you have children or not. It doesn't matter whether you're married or not. This is about your life, and there's a better way to live your life. And some of these principles lay that out. So we start with this principle right off the bat. There are no perfect families. There are no perfect families. So, instead of looking for perfect, we're going to look for what's better and see if we can work on that. So, I want you to watch this video for a second, if you would, and it describes a little bit of what better looks like.
The reason I said fame and fortune was frivolous to me is because we were raised really poor. I mean, my brothers, we had one bed, one room, but nobody told us we were poor, and I was just as happy. We were in the outdoors. Every day was an adventure to me, and the reason is because we love, who we're with our family, and that's really the reason we love to hunt. It's not so much about what we get to eat or, how many ducks we shoot. It's about who we're with. And so if you're happy in that situation and you realize what true happiness is, which to me is God, people, and then whatever else, number 3. With me, it's ducks. I realized, what are you going to buy? You can't buy that. I was just as happy when we had nothing. So,
and when we met, when we were teenagers, I noticed that about their family. My parents, my dad's a preacher and my mom was a school teacher at a Christian school, so we didn't have hardly anything either. And so what attracted us to each other was what we saw in each other in our faith. And we dated very young, got married very young, and that's basically been our own motto. We've been very happy for 22 years before the money started coming in. So we have our core values as a family, and we've kept them, and that's our number one priority is making sure that our kids know that, so they also will have the same values, no matter what circumstances come your way. If God is your solid foundation, good or bad, you're going to be happy. You're going to be joyous if you're in Him, and that's what we stand on.
Okay, so maybe you heard some key words there that were really important. One was faith is what attracted them to each other, and I think that's great. Another thing was, before all the money came in, we were happy. And the reason we were happy comes back to the last statement that he says, or that she says, which is, if God is your solid foundation, good or bad, you are going to be happy. So I'm going to talk today for just a few minutes more, and I'm going to talk about something very elementary and very basic. And you're going to walk out of here saying, I've heard that 100 times. But I got an angle on it that I think every single one of us, no matter what our families look like and what our lives look like, I've got something that I really think we all need to pay close attention to. The foundation of any home, no matter what it looks like and no matter how it's composed or comprised, is going to be a key to whether or not you're going to have a happy life going forward. And that value is that a solid foundation for the family is based on a relationship with God. A solid foundation for a family is based on a relationship with God. Psalm 127 verse 1 says, unless the Lord builds the house, the builders build in vain. And I think that's really true, and it seems so simple to all of us who've been in church a long time, but unless the Lord is actually the one that is building your home, whatever it looks like, you're going to build in vain if it's not Him that you put this foundation in. And that probably seems very elementary. It may seem like I'm preaching to the choir, and I get all of that. But we don't have choirs anymore, so I'm preaching to you. And there's something that threatens our homes. Something I think we got to pay really close attention to. And that is this word that I have, that I'm thinking a lot about, and I've been thinking all week about this. It's the word erosion. The word erosion. The number one threat to the foundation of any home, no matter what it looks like, is erosion. The erosion of values that you once considered important, but are no longer that important to you because other things have crowded in and they've creeped into your life, and you've given some things up that you never imagined that you ever would. Erosion is the diminishing of something that is important, especially over time. It's the diminishing of something that's important. You have a foundation in a house, and I didn't know this, but I knew what I grew up with was trailer homes and mobile homes, and I knew that you had to block the trailers right in order for them to work. You had to get levels and all that kind of stuff, and you had to do all that. And if you didn't get the blocks right, the trailer was never going to really work at all. It wasn't going to work like it was supposed to. So the blocks would have been the foundation. I've seen houses where there's lots of foundation. Now in Oklahoma, we don't live with basements very much at all. But we had a basement in Iowa, and Pam grew up with a big old basement in her house and everything. And there are people who know how to look at those basements and look at the foundation, and they can see whether there's some erosion going on, something that's chipping away at it in one way or the other. In coastal areas, and I think this has always been interesting for me, growing up 60 miles from the coast of Oregon, that I would go back and forth and not notice any change at all. But over time, the longer I went back and forth to the coast, the longer of time between those visits, I would see change. And guess what was happening? Wind, water was eroding the coastal areas. And that's happening even today in some significant ways all over our world, is this erosion that's happening. Well, this is true too in values. Many of us have a period in our life where we set some values. Many times it's built on the scripture and maybe some teaching or whatever it is that you've had in your life, and you have this list of values. But if you don't pay attention to the values, and if you don't go back and look at the values in your life on a regular basis, you're going to end up with erosion in those values. And here's how it shows up in the world today. People have problems in their home with their kids, or they have problems with their spouse, or they just have problems in their heart, and they're struggling with things and all of that. And they say, I got to go see somebody. I need to go talk to somebody. And so what do? They come and talk to me. Now, I'm the best person available, at least on the surface, right off the bat. Here's why. I'm free. Okay? I don't charge anybody anything. I have a friend who for years, he got counseling so much that he started charging people to counsel. He's a preacher of a church. And I'm just like, I could never do that. I won't do that. And so I'm free. People come in and talk to me, and they don't like what I say, and I get all that. I mean, that's how it works and stuff. And so they get frustrated. Maybe after 5 visits or something like that, they think, that guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And so somebody says, I got this counselor down the road, and he's really, really great. Why don't you go and see him? And so they decide to go see him. And they get in there, and they have the guy is saying the exact same things that I am saying, okay? But the deal is that they had to pay $125 an hour for him, and so they think, man, I'm going to do this no matter what. When it's free, you're not inclined to do it. But when you pay for it, you're inclined to figure all this out and try to do the best you can with it. And that's the struggle that people have with values, and it can be values when you're a teenager. In your life right now, you've got values. You got values in young adulthood. You got values in senior adulthood. And they don't always look exactly the same, but if they are pointed toward God, and here's the thing, if the value that you protect the most is your value of a solid foundation with God, you're going to have a better life. You're going to have a better life. Is it going to be perfect? Not necessarily, but it's going to be better. And it doesn't mean that it isn't going to be without sad times or difficult times and hardships and things like that. That's all going to be part of it. But you're going to be equipped with a better foundation in order to withstand some of those things. It's like when a storm comes. And I was talking to a guy this morning. I guess there was a lot of storms somewhere in this area last night. It wasn't at our house, but there was. And he was saying that all the basketball goals in the neighborhood all flipped over at the same time last night. And they're all loose on the driveway and that kind of thing. But storms happen, don't they? And guess what? No matter how perfect you are, and no matter how inclined you are to love God with all your heart, you're still going to have storms. And those storms are going to come, and then you're going to find out whether or not you really have a foundation. By the way, Jesus talked about this, didn't he? If a man builds a house on sand, what happens when the storm comes blowing through? Washed away. But if he builds it on the rock, it withstands the storms, doesn't it? The end of the Sermon on the Mount. And that can be for any stage in your life. It can be for parenthood. It can be for church life. All of those things so important. So what I want to do is I want to give you a couple things to kind of think about. I want 3 things, first of all, about erosion. Number 1, erosion brings about subtle changes to foundations. Okay, it's subtle. Usually it doesn't just happen overnight, and it's not the result of one incident, but it happens over time. And then erosion also will eventually show up in damage above the ground. Eventually it'll show up in damage above the ground, especially if it's chipping away your foundation, right? We have a house that's three years old. It's pretty new. But I noticed the other day that not all our doors shut right. And that's changed in the last 6 months. Now that may be just because it's hot and it's the give and take and kind of thing, and I'll watch it and everything, but that's where it shows up, isn't it? In doorways or little cracks above doorways, and we had those in Owasso after 17 years. You try to sell a house, what do you do with the cracks? Try to cover them up because you got to sell the house, right? And if somebody asks you, you have to be honest and say, yes, there's crack there, and yeah, a little bit of movement and stuff, but it's subtle, but it happens both below and above. And then the third thing is if you're not paying attention to your foundation, it could get to be too late. Now think about that, how that works in our relationship with God. That if we begin to if we have a really solid foundation with God, and everything's going well and everything, but stuff starts happening, and all of a sudden things start crowding out our disciplines with God and our prayer with God and those kinds of things. That's all part of attacking that foundation. And when it does, then you're going to have subtle changes. Maybe if you're farther from God than you were 6 months ago, you're not as nice to your spouse. Maybe you're frustrated with your kids. Maybe you're disappointed in yourself and wondering where's life heading, those kinds of things. They're all very real and true. And that happens with our relationship with God. So when you weaken your spiritual structures, you do it when you don't pay attention to your foundation. And so that's why this is so important. And let me say this to you. You may go, man, it's so simple, but it's hard to do over 60 years or 80 years. Some people are better at it than others, and I admire those people so much. So the big question is how do you protect your home from relational and spiritual erosion? Now, some of you have been married 70 plus years, and you may think, boy, this is one series I don't need. Oh, yes, it is, because the temptation to have the foundation that you've had all these years to be eroded. I've seen people who were married and in their 80s who did some really stupid things because their foundation was all chipped out. So don't just think because you get around the block a few times that this isn't going to apply to you. All of this will apply to you. So how do you do it? How do you do it when you sit and you think in your home as you've had all this conflict, or maybe it's children that aren't paying attention, or maybe they're not being obedient, or maybe it's a spouse that's really gotten distant, or whatever it is. How do you keep yourself from saying, how did we get here? And then go, I don't know. 3 things. Number 1, do regular foundation checks. Do regular foundation checks. Now, this is relational and spiritual. This isn't the building necessarily of the home. I know that's hard on a house, when you're doing it, but when you think about your relationship with God, that's more out in the open between you and Him. Do relational, foundational checks. You do that all the time, you know that. I went to the doctor the other day. Actually, my doctor that I've had for the last 2 years decided he didn't want me anymore. I thought that was rude, but he was going into a different phase of medicine, and I didn't qualify. And I tried to wiggle around a little bit and say, man, I don't want to change doctors again and all that stuff. So I changed doctors. I did not understand that when they gave me the name of a doctor with the last name, that she was a female. And I thought, I have never had a female doctor. How's this going to work? Well, so I go and I sit and listen and, pay $500 for the first visit. My insurance paid for it, but, go through all this stuff and everything. And she started asking me questions that I hadn't been asked in 25 years. You know what she was doing? She was helping me do a foundation check. And in a lot of ways, I appreciate it. And so now I got all these other doctors I got to go see because she's setting that up. But I probably hadn't done a really great job on that part of it. And so sometimes you got to have somebody that you trust at least a little bit to help you make those checks too, right? And that means you got to ask the right questions. We go to the doctor for a checkup. We do regular maintenance on our cars. Some of us do that more frequently than others. Some of us have portfolios, and you meet with your broker regularly. When you get your teeth clean, you do that in order to keep up on things. So what do foundation checks look like for somebody who's in a home, whatever it looks like? Here it comes down a couple things you can scribble down on the side. Number 1 is basic disciplines with God. Basic disciplines with God. When you come into being part of the family of God and people say, now if you want to grow, what you've got to do is you've got to spend time in the Word, and you think, I'm going to spend time in the Word, I'm going to do that. You know what happens over time if you're not careful? Other things kind of crowd that out. They really do. And some of you are nodding your heads because you know exactly what I'm talking about. You have to be disciplined. And one of the ways to do a foundational check is to make sure that the basic disciplines such as prayer and Bible study are occurring in your life. And guess what? Nobody is exempt from erosion in this. Right? Nobody is. I'm not. Okay? And there are seasons and there are times where I catch myself going through all the stuff that I do, even when I'm teaching the Bible, but sometimes I'm not doing much for my own soul. And I got to stop that. And I've got to remember that I don't have anything to give anybody if I'm not with God and in a solid relationship with Him. And the disciplines are one of the most obvious things that you can do. Here's the other thing. It's community. It's community. Community helps us maintain our foundations when we're spending time with other people who are of like faith and are in the same neighborhood that we are in. And I think this is really important because isolation will erode the foundation of your soul quicker than anything. And it happens, doesn't it? You remember, I didn't spend much time on David and Bathsheba, but all you got to do is look in the Bible and you see the story of David, and all it says at the beginning of that chapter with the whole thing with Bathsheba was, in the spring, when the men normally went out to fight battle, David stayed home. Bad deal. Because he was isolated. The people who were closest to him weren't around him as much then, and he caught himself in a bad spot, found himself in a really bad spot. And so community is important. And when I say community, what am I talking about? I'm talking about groups. I'm talking about Sunday school classes, which really are just groups. They're just groups where you teach, but you also fellowship. I mean, this class that meets in A4 right here, whose class is that anyway? Santa Claus right there. They were laughing so hard this morning that I almost went over and tried to shut them down. I mean, we can have none of that in Sunday school, right? No, we love it. Love it. And that kind of relational stuff that's happening in these classes, they're part of what keeps your foundation solid. And so I want to challenge you at the beginning of the year, right now, the beginning of the school year, kids are going to school, you need to go to Sunday school. It's an hour. You're up anyway. And if you need help, we'll help you get into one that fits. We got different age groups studying different things. But let me just make the plea to you, do not buy the lie that you can isolate. And I don't care how old you are. I don't care how long you've been in church. When you begin to isolate, the foundation of your spiritual soul begins to erode, and all of a sudden you're not as close to God as you once were. So don't isolate. Be in community. Be doing the basic disciplines. And then continue all of that with your family, whatever your family looks like. Now, I'm going to be a little bit more specific here, but I think it's really important for us in family life especially. We have to withstand the constant demand for our attention from other people and other things. And we live in a world today that is really hard for that. And I look at Gracie, who's 11 years old, and she wants a phone so bad she can just spit. And she's got a phone now, but it's a phone that only works to certain numbers, and it's all got all kinds of stuff, to keep her from going places she shouldn't go. And she just feels so good because, she can. Now, she doesn't call me. Maybe I'm not in her number, but I'm going to change that. So, but this is really important when it comes to social media, too. And again, I don't care if you're 85 years old or 8 years old. Social media can be a great thing in some ways, and it can be a tremendous curse in others. And I've seen social media stuff tear up churches because people get on there and they start punching at things, and people take it wrong, and then they think it's them that's in trouble and all this. It can just get so bad. So it doesn't matter whether it's for your kids or for you. You need to make sure that you are controlling social media and that social media is not controlling you. And that's really going to come back to your foundation with God. I was talking to somebody this week and having a great conversation with them. One of the things that they said is, I am really working hard on just being present in our home. Just being present. And I didn't ask them what that exactly meant. I just thought, wow, I need to be more present. And it's hard for me to do that. I get distracted pretty easy, but I need to be more present in my home too. And I thought that was a great challenge for me. I think this is a person who does regular foundation checks. So what is it for you? Whatever it is for you, do it, and do it regularly. Make notes. Put stuff in your calendar. Maybe take a retreat day once a year when you really do think about that kind of stuff. You can do that kind of stuff if you think it's important enough to you to do regular foundation checks. Here's the second thing. Don't ignore obvious signs of erosion. Now, I do this so much. And I think when it comes down to Abraham, Adam and Eve, everybody in the Bible, I think this is probably one of the things that happens is that there starts to be erosion, but they're just going strong and they're not really paying a lot of attention, and all of a sudden they've got a big problem on their hands. I have that problem with teeth. I do not like dentists. Matter of fact, I really, really, really dislike dentists a lot. Dentists make me cry, and they do. I cannot handle it. I don't like people poking in my mouth. I got one dentist that's taken me all my adult life to like him, and so I like him. And then I called him this week because I had a problem with a tooth, and he said, well, I'm going out of town and all this stuff. And he said, my little brother, and he's up in Owasso, he says, my little brother is in Edmond, and he's a great dentist. You'd like him a lot, and all that. I said, really? I mean, what I wanted to say, is that the best you could do? You know? And he gave me his phone number, and I was very compliant, hung up. I've not called that guy. I can't bring myself to do it. I don't want to start over with another dentist. So I'm praying that my tooth will hang in there for 3 more weeks so that I can go get it fixed. Because it's just the way I am. But now, I'm not saying that to be necessarily proud of it. I'm just saying it is reality for a lot of us. We ignore the obvious signs. And when you do that, you end up with problems. What's it look like, these obvious signs? Well, here's a couple things. One is change in communication patterns. Okay, when there's a change in communication patterns, the flag is being flown up. And this becomes really a big deal, especially with parents and kids, because what happens when a kid gets to be 4th, 5th grade? All of a sudden, they're starting to think for themselves, and they don't tell you everything they're doing, and sometimes you kind of feel like they're maybe sneaking around, and when they were 5, it was okay, but when they're 11, it's kind of scary, and when they're 18, it's really scary, and so you got to really, really understand these communication patterns that you have. And if there are dramatic changes, that may be one of the obvious signs of erosion. So you want to be careful with that. Here's another one, changes in the calendar. Okay? We'll talk more about margin later. But when you begin to get squeezed more and more, individually and then as a couple and then as a home, or a family, then you're going to end up, your calendar is going to scream at you that there's erosion happening. And so you just need to listen. I need to listen and pay attention to that for sure. When you have no margin in your life, you're in a lot of trouble. And some of you know that. Here's the third thing. No matter how difficult it is, tackle the repairs as soon as possible. Tackle the repairs as soon as possible. If you ignore erosion, you will pay a steep price later. I have paid more to this dentist that I have because I've ignored my teeth, and that's dumb. And so I've been working very hard the last 3 or 4 years to get back in the right place with that. I got one tooth left. Not one tooth in my mouth, but one tooth that needs work, okay, to do that. So think about it, but what starts out as an issue in your home, maybe with parenting, when kids are younger, it can turn out to be a super severe problem when they're in teenage years. And maybe you've just hoped that it would all get better. Let me tell you what, relational problems don't just all get better, okay? It takes work, and it takes discipline, and it takes admitting that maybe there's an issue here or there with your children, with your spouse, with your life, with your own heart, whatever it is. And let me just say this to you, those of you with little kids, work on your marriage now. Don't wait until your kids are out of the house because you won't have a marriage to work on. You won't. So start now, whatever it is. Don't ignore God and hope it will get better. It won't get better unless you make the effort. This is true individually as well. We work to get stronger and stronger, and when we do, we live better. Now that's one value. solid relationship with God is where you start on trying to build a better home. Chuck Swindoll is my favorite preacher, and he's 85 years old now, preaches down in Dallas. He's been a church leader and a preacher for over 60 years. He's written multiples and multiples of books. I have most of his books, and I love reading them. He wrote an essay not long ago, even at age 85, which I thought was amazing, and the essay was just called Erosion. Erosion. And he describes a science project. Maybe you'll remember this project when you're sitting at the science table and the teacher gives you a frog and says, put the frog in the water, and then over time just inch up the heat little by little by little. Guess what the frog does? Frog boils to death, even though the frog could have gotten out of the little container anytime it wanted to. It never saw what was happening underneath at all. Swindoll talks about that, and he talks about that science experiment that he had, and I thought it was really good because one of the things that's really a struggle in our life is as we go along and the longer we live, the more we think we got it all together, and we don't really have anybody that's willing to have the guts enough to tell us maybe we don't. There was a man in the Bible by the name of Solomon who was much this way. He had everything, and he thought he was all that, and yet it all slipped away for him. Swindoll writes this, and I'll close this today. Deterioration is never sudden. No garden suddenly overgrows with thorns. No church suddenly splits. No marriage suddenly breaks down. No nation suddenly becomes a mediocre power. No one person suddenly becomes base. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, certain things are accepted that once were rejected. Now, you ought to just make a note of that. Things that become accepted that once were rejected. This is the culture that we live in today in so many ways. Things that once were considered hurtful are secretly tolerated. At the outset, it appears harmless, perhaps even exciting, but the wedge it brings leaves a gap that grows wider as moral erosion joins hands with spiritual decay, and then the gap becomes a canyon. And it's pretty interesting when you're standing on a canyon, the gap is so wide, isn't it? It's crazy. Some of you have been to the Grand Canyon, and you know that when you look across, you think there's no way I can get across there, and you have to go down and go up, and it is a tremendous amount of work to do. That's the way it is with our life when we don't pay attention to our values. And if you don't have any values, you need to get some values. I'm going to help you with that in this series. But if you have values, this would be a great week to spend some time thinking about how your values are doing, how your foundation's doing, and to check for erosion, too. Would you stand, please? Our Father, there is more to say in these 5 sermons than can possibly be said. So I pray right off the bat that you would help us to pick out the very best things that will help us live a better life. I pray, Father, that we would remember these words in Psalm 127, that unless the builder is God, the builders build in vain. And that puts you right at the foundation. No matter what our circumstances are, no matter who we are, no matter whether we're married and have families, whether we're single and don't have families, old or young, new to the faith or not so new, would you help us remember, God, that you have to be the solid foundation of our faith and our life. And then we can start working on things. So God, let us hear your words carefully today and cause us to think soberly this week as we think about the foundations in our family. pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.